Hello everybody and welcome to HT2201, Theories of Contemporary Architecture, and today's lecture on biopolitical space. So this lecture contributes a further framework for the conceptualization of contemporary architecture through theory, building on our previous work on new materialities, circulatory systems, and the undercommons. Today's thinking focuses on the idea of biopolitical space. And of course, essential to this endeavor is defining and understanding what is it that we mean by biopolitical space. And we're going to break down this idea of the biopolitical into its components. Bios meaning life, and the political broadly referring to power. And this is a way of thinking critically and analytically, I suppose, about our very personal experience of the world historical events in which we are currently caught up in the post-pandemic planetary situation. So that's our goal, where we want to end up to by the end of this lecture. And in order to do so, we're going to look rigorously through some of the earlier history of bios and the biopolitical space, and see where we get to. Now, to do this, to make this move, to set up this biopolitical framework, we're going to work through a series of scales. And these scales are all encompassed by the kind of largest cosmic framework of life itself. And we're going to start by looking at the scale of the house as a scene and as a site, as a domain of the biopolitical, something that encloses and frames life and its own kind of domestic politics and power. And then we're going to move from the scale of the house to the scale of the institution, and think of the institution in systemic terms, in terms of its architectural systems. And from that scale, we're going to move to the scale of the city. And this leap in scale, in terms of thinking of what kind of life, what kind of bios is appropriate to the city, and how is it interarticulated with the particular form of politics that happen at the scale of the city. This will entail us thinking about the biopolitics of infrastructure, and that's a question inherently of urbanism, developing from the scale of the architectural. Now, where we want to end up at the end of this lecture, to set us up for when we meet in person to discuss this, is the kind of last scalar shift, which is to the scale of the planet, and to think about what I'm calling here planetary systems technologies. These are systems, infrastructures, technologies which operate at the scale of the planet. And this, I think, is a question that we must think about, given the planetary nature of the post-pandemic world that we're currently living in and through. But this will raise a question about architecture and about urbanism, which is, can they exist at that scale? Can we, as architects, as designers and thinkers, operate at the scale of the planetary and the cosmic? So that's really the question where we want to end up by this lecture, beginning at the house, going through the institution, the city, to end up at the biopolitical scale of the planet. And along the way, the really essential, I think, definitional, conceptual, theoretical work is going to be to further break down this idea of the biopolitical, and come out of this session, hopefully, with a new framework with which to approach all kinds of architectural questions, and to be able to evaluate space and projects and our own work in terms of its biopolitical qualities. Well, to begin at the scale of the house, perhaps one of the smallest units of enclosure and regulation of life, we have a very good opportunity to engage our immediate context in LA. And that's because, as you will know, LA has been the site of considerable experimentation in what it means to live, how to live, what style of living, what relationship architecture might have to the body on an individual and highly intimate basis, and particularly how the house becomes the site of a regulation or imposition of particular forms of bodily regime or bodily experience in relationship to environment. I'm going to be drawing quite a lot on some of the work, the great amount of work that's been done on questions of domesticity and the house and architecture within Los Angeles and Southern California and California in general. One of these kind of classic books in this line is Thomas Haines's Architecture of the Sun, Los Angeles Modernism 1900 to 1970. It's a massive book, and there are many copies in the library, and I kind of encourage you to consult this for further reference. But just to see, we're going to begin by closely reading two houses that were commissioned by a single family, the Lovells, and that were commissioned from two separate but very closely connected architects, Rudolf Schindler and Richard Neutra, both of whom happened to be Viennese, that is Austrian emigres to the United States, and knew each other very well. And you see here the geography that we're going to encompass. One of these houses up here in just on the edge of Griffith Park, and the other, the beach house, further south, just out of LA, in Newport Beach. So an hour and a half's drive away from one another, traversing the geography and topography and climate and urban infrastructure of the city that we're all kind of focused in at the moment. So the first property, we're going to start at the beach, and this is a property you can drive to, you can see it. I mean, it's private, but it's publicly viewable. And we're going to approach this house as a kind of case study into the regulation of life by architecture at the scale of a house. Now, this is the situation in the landscape of the Lovell beach house, and you see it fronts the beach, this large expanse of golden California sand with the hills in the background and the ocean on one side. And it was built in 1926. And at the heart of it is this very large, capacious, double-height volume and living area. And you see this huge window and glazing that gives out directly onto the beach. And to the side of it, elevated somewhat, are living quarters, including outdoor sleeping areas. So there's that window with its wooden mullions, obviously designed to gather in the environment, gather in the light, and illumine. And that is the really interesting structural system. And you see very large stilts which lift up the living area off of the ground, give it a degree of privacy, but also frees up that space underneath the living area with those perforated structural stilts. And that space can be inhabited. It's a kind of semi-indoor, outdoor space with steps going down to the beach, an area for vegetation, plants, for play. It was a family home. And you can see better there the structural system in a construction photograph, reinforced concrete. And Schindler, the architect, famously didn't use measured drawings or engineering drawings, construction drawings. And so the construction was done kind of on site, off the basis of these quite rough sketches in a sort of spontaneous way. But in this model that was post-produced, you get a sense of the perforated facade of the building, the way that it invites the outside in through multiple apertures. And these sight lines that open up through the structure, giving it a degree of transparency and a progressive gradation of light and enclosure and thickness of surround and porosity as you go from the exterior to that nicely protected interior void and volume. Those are the exterior sleeping balconies, and that faces the ocean. And you see the patternation of light that comes from all of these apertures and openings. As the kind of sun moves round, that produces a kind of drama of light within the building. And there you see the roof has been taken off the model, and you're able to see how the large living space volume, the void, is offset against those smaller living areas. And again, this is the outside, really intricate working of the reinforced concrete to incorporate stairs, steps, planters. And this was a space that could take advantage of the Californian climate. It was an open fire pit place for cooking outside. Inside there was an interior balcony that would run at the upper height to give these views back onto the interior. And here are the famous outside sleeping balconies. And this is where the building really starts to signify a particular attitude to health, to exposure to the elements, particularly exposure to light, and light providing the organizing principle around which the space of the house is organized, and therefore also the life of the family is organized. And you see these quite kind of fluid connections between kitchen area, living area. A lot of the furniture is built in. It's all made out of the same wood that was used in the structural system. And vegetation has an important, it's like an equal inhabitant or cohabitant. It cohabits the house with the humans. So there's a sense of being very close to the ocean, being close to other life forms, as well as the architect having this total involvement in every aspect of the environment. So all of this wooden furniture designed by Schindler and brought together on site. In a very close relationship between the architect and the client. So a very distinct patronage system within this kind of a house. It's a private house that's being commissioned by a client, working very closely to reflect their style of life in the architecture. And again, picking up on this theme of light, you see these clerestory windows. Clerestory windows being high up between the walls and the roof to engage another level of transparency, to dematerialize the wall where it meets the roof. You see there right at the top, to let another directionality of the ocean lights come in. And there you get a sense of this interpenetration of the inside by the ocean views of the outside. And even when you're looking from the ocean in, you see how that concrete ribbon takes you round from the facade and dives into the interior. The house has been modified over the years, and what were some parts that were more open have been closed in. Now, in addition to the kind of architecture, ordinarily speaking, the plumbing was pretty interesting. And the Lovells were interested in sort of rituals of health. And this is a marathon shower, and it was designed for weight loss. and you were to actually lie down and kind of get pummeled by this high-powered shower. Another aspect that was important to life at the Lovell Beach House was exposure to UV rays through private nude sunbathing, and we're going to encounter, a guide who's not going to nude sunbathe, I don't think, but to indicate that this area of the house was, where you could come in direct contact with the light, with the elements, and that was an important part of the way in which they regulated their collective lives together down by the ocean. And it's important to say that the Lovells had a particular reason for having the house designed in this way, and that was because Lovell himself, the patron, was a naturopath. That is, a kind of someone who was into alternative medicine, someone who had a column in the LA Times, who wrote extensively and very publicly, and was a very well-known figure in alternative ways of life. And a lot to do with that had to do with sleeping outside, being exposed to the elements, and not taking drugs, not drinking alcohol, not taking caffeine, swimming a lot, but not in chlorinated water. So someone who embodied a form of experimentalism in terms of how life and architecture could work together to produce new forms of human coexistence. Now, Lovell became successful as a naturopath, as this sort of leader of alternative medicine, and in addition to the beach house, a couple of years later, commissioned another house. This one known as the Health House, and where the beach house was located down here at Newport Beach. The Health House is just in the foothills of Griffith Park in kind of North LA. And this is its really dramatic elevation set in the landscape. And this house was commissioned from, not from Schindler, who made the first house, but from Schindler's one-time friend and close associate, Richard Neutra. And this really formed Neutra's entry into LA and California architecture, and there's a great story in the further work that he produced in the region. This is the final drawing. And you see, one of the immediate differences between this and the beach house is topographic. The house is built in a very dramatic site. You see the steepness of the land that it's based upon. And it was also, situated within a hilly atmosphere, close to a more kind of wooded, planted, shaded environment. And you can see the sense of being suspended within the tree canopy, and the views out of those windows would, of course, look straight out into that tree canopy, situating life within the general biological context of the Southern California site. And you enter at the top floor, at the third floor, from the street. And that entryway, you see here also the outdoor sleeping balconies. So Lovell was really insistent that sleeping outside, being exposed to the cosmos, as it were, would send kind of healing, energizing rays into your body by sunlight or starlight. And from that top floor, there's a very dramatic, large volume staircase that winds down through the building and through the site. to the lowest level, where there's a pool, unchlorinated, of course, in line with the Lovell's naturopathic sense of freedom from drugs and chemicals. Outdoor life, being exposed to the atmosphere, living out there, cooking out there, eating, was an important part of the way that this particular domestic environment regulates space. Now, structurally, that was all held together by a steel frame. And it's generally said that 1929, when Neutscher built this house, this steel framework, look at that lovely kind of lattice, very light, perforated framework, very quick to produce, quick to assemble, all kind of prefabricated beams brought together on site, bolted together, very lightweight truss system. It's generally thought to be the first steel frame house to be built in America. And then overlaid onto that light steel lattice work is this thicker massing of concrete, steel panels, and glass. And that then becomes a kind of compositional problem of solidity and dematerialization, as well as light and shade, that Neutscher is playing with the facade. And creating all kinds of transparency and perforation through the use of glass, but also shuttering and voids, and pushing planes forward, receding others, creating hangovers, suspending balconies and floors from the roof plate, and these lovely turned up roof to give kind of gesture and finish and precision to the contour and the silhouette of the building. And you see that the light and the atmosphere is invited inside the building, windows on all sides, to produce conditions for maximum cross-ventilation, to fill the house with the external atmosphere and provide as many apertures, as many portals and openings for the interpenetration of the external environment and the domestic space on the inside. So together, these are, and by the way, a gym was built in the garden. And as you will have read from Beatrice Colomina's work on X-ray architecture and the relationship in general between health and architecture and the body, the house, I think we should consider as a space for the construction of a version of the human. So a space for the fashioning and the production of a new version of the human body in line with particular modernist ideologies, and in this case Californian ideologies, about what health constitutes, what the appropriate form of life for a family is, what are the ways in which one should relate to one's environment. So the house and its architecture become a means of mediating human life with the environment, with the atmosphere, in an attempt to try to achieve equilibrium through design, homeostasis, an ideal interpenetration of internal and external human and environmental factors. And by the way, this can go in many further directions. This is not an exhaustive reading by any case, by any stretch of the imagination. And I would just like to highlight one further complexity one could introduce into this work by referring to the work of Sylvia Levin, who has also read the house as a kind of psychosexual libidinal space in which contemporary eroticizations of domesticity were entertained. And this fascinating story about how the Lovells, as naturopaths, established a cultural circle around them that was focused on what they call the orgiastic potency of space and environment, so that the the architectural enclosure starts to have a relationship with this fascinating artifact, the orgon box. And I kind of encourage you to read this article. It's uploaded as a PDF on the Mirror board to understand this full story. But the orgon box was something designed by Wilhelm Reich, another émigré student of Freud, who felt that he had discovered orgon, this kind of orgasmic cosmic energy which was radiating around the world, particularly in Southern California perhaps, and needed to be harnessed in order to cure the fundamentally neurotic nature of modern life and people's anxieties and issues of mental health and general well-being. This is one of his cloud buster machines. He believed that if you shot orgon energy at clouds, you could make them rain and make the deserts of Arizona fertile. He established a research laboratory, and it doesn't look very appealing, but this is an orgon box in which one would supposedly sit in order to be exposed by radiating orgiastic energies. But the point that Sylvia Levin's making in this piece is that this orgon box and kind of the cloud buster apparatus are what this house is also doing. It's an apparatus for re-equibrillating the human in all of its orgiastic potency, in the kind of fullness of its life, whether that's erotic or biological or psychopathological, physiological. The house becomes a way of regulating and maintaining particular forms of life and energies. Now, this way of conceptualizing the building can be taken further. And what we're looking at here is a diagram, you may well have seen it before, by Rainer Banham and Francois Dallagré. It's known as Anatomy of a Dwelling. And it's a schematic and polemical diagram of a dwelling. But of course, it doesn't look like you could live in it. But when you look up close, you see that what is being described here are all of the life support systems, all of the environmental engineering, all of the interstitial infrastructures, the fume extractions, the ventilating systems, the radio antennae, the water tanks, the inputs and outputs, inflows and outflows, the plumbing, that all of which controls the atmospheric and liquid environment that sustains life within architecture. So no walls, no floors, no apertures, no kind of design in any sense of a formal partie, no sense of sort of composition, sculpture, massing. Architecture or dwelling is hereby announced to be an apparatus, or a series of apparatuses, a series of regulatory mechanisms which facilitate the life and regeneration of the body, understood as an organism that requires inputs and outputs of moisture and air and fluids and all kinds of things. And one could break down a house like the two Lovell houses into their flues, into their fireplaces, into their plumbing and their shower systems, into their dechlorinated swimming pools. And one would get something like this, a different picture, a different form of representation of what architecture is and how it relates to life. Now, Banham, who was British but spent a considerable amount of time living in California and writing about it, published this work and kind of introduce this here partly to sort of reinforce and try and kind of establish some fundamental ideas of the historiography of architecture, particularly as it relates to our LA context. And just pulled out some of the illustrations of this text. They might not look fascinating in themselves, but this is a text in which quantification of atmospheric variables, statistics, the statitization of life, and as a representation of dwelling. And images, look at this for a representation of of a piece of architecture. It's architecture that has been essentialized to ductwork, to pipes. And this means, remember, this is published, Banham was working in the 60s, so this is kind of early work that's being done. But the kinds of things that are being represented and described are atmospheric. They're kind of qualities of light, degrees of comfort, temperature, flows of liquid through and around the atmosphere of the building. And this also leads to and necessitates particular forms of architectural representation. So you see in the book that it's littered with cutaway sections in axonometric. And this form of projection allows you to cut away and explode and pick apart and see the insides, the kind of internal anatomies of architecture and the systems that sustain it. And this kind of use of the diagrammatic arrow as a way of describing the circulation of particles through an architectural space. So this mode of conceptualizing architecture as a kind of life-giving and life-regulating mechanism also implies different forms of representation. Now, let's actually just dive in briefly and look inside that very text. And begin with one of Banham's sort of great case studies. And it looks like a really awful, boring, ugly building. And it is in some ways. It's a hospital built in the early 20th century in Belfast in Ireland. But Banham's kind of somewhat cheeky point is that this building, which one wouldn't look at from the point of view of, say, style or form, is important for this reason, which is that the architectural form of the building derives from the control of the internal environmental conditions, and that the form of the building and its internal environment are inextricably entangled. And of course, a hospital building is a pretty good case study for this type of an argument. And Banham is really interested in this overall typological form of the building, this very large span structure with large volume that incorporates many, many highly regularized inhabitants. And so you see, when you look closely at the plan, that the wards of the hospital are laid out with all of the beds. And maybe this is starting to call to mind some of the images that we've seen much more recently in the news of COVID hospitals, field hospitals, and their rapid construction. Now, the kind of rationale for packing all of the accommodation into a single structural volume was to avoid heat wastage from the underground ducts between separated buildings. So this starts to be a kind of architecture which, certainly in plan and section, is being motivated by environmental systems, by the systems that sustain the quality of air and therefore life within the hospital environment. And that effectively means that the maximum compactness of the plan is combined with a minimum length of the duct. Well, what is Banham referring to when he means the duct? Well, it has this series of closely drawn diagrams in which he illustrates the air filtration system and the air circulation mechanism, which is this motor, which describes the pathway of the air from the atmosphere into the mechanical apparatus, and then out through this duct where it's siphoned off by the various parts of the ward to perform its role. And you see that that duct system and air filtration system is part of this larger air circulation system, which, when you look back at the plan, you see that now that plan is effectively a diagram of the air circulation system. That blue line is the underground air duct that runs along the length of the building, and then the individual wards are structured through the outflows from that main duct into side ducts. So the whole form of the building is derived from the air conditioning system. And that is why this building, otherwise not just unremarkable but kind of ugly looking, becomes for Banham in fact a paradigmatic building of modernity. And it also sort of sounds the kind of death of ornamentation, that it makes the ornamented facade and kind of decorative details of the building totally irrelevant to the fundamental purpose and functioning of the building, which is to sustain life in the most efficient and optimal way possible. Now, this Banham's way of thinking had some quite direct and immediate consequences for the way that contemporary architects and designers were thinking about design. And the work of Archigram, Peter Cook in particular, was one of those architects who took up this idea of the starting point of architecture being in the air duct, in the pipe, in the regulatory mechanism, in the infrastructures and the mechanical engineering of a building, as opposed to its overall formalism and kind of sculptured silhouette. So when you look at these drawings of the plug-in city, they're all drawings of infrastructure, they're all drawings of environmental system, also structural system, but everything else has been pared away. And you see that also in, this is the, I think it's called the University Node, a section of that city. And you see, really clearly these, the physiology of the building. It's being drawn almost as if it has a kind of living anatomy. It's being seen as a system of regulatory and coordinated parts, each one of which supplies something different and necessary for life to be sustained. Now, in the world of actual construction, Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers's 1977 Pompidou Center in Paris is probably the best kind of realization of this kind of architecture. And you'll see that the air conditioning system, the inflow and outflow of water, heating, as well as the structural engineering, is all you've got when you see the building. These are the dominating and highly colorized, diagrammatized realization of the building as a system, as a mechanism for the regulation of life, combined with this wonderful circulatory system as well. So, this line of thinking could then be extended further from the 70s into our contemporary moment. And, look how much more complicated that kind of way of seeing can get if you factor in building information modeling and the multiplication of infrastructural systems that go in to a contemporary piece of architecture on a kind of fairly large urban scale. And the sheer volume and quantity of components becomes kind of extreme. And, in contrast, a more standard sectional representation of the building looks sort of banal or just kind of minimal in terms of its complexity compared with the environmental engineering of the site. And, the facade, very mute, doesn't give much away about what is going on inside. And so for us, the proposition or the provocation is to approach architecture from this from the position of this kind of engineering. Now, this has brought us to a position where we're able to add another layer, another valence onto our understanding of biopolitical architecture, and that is to double down on the very term, the biopolitical, and on biopower, and to look at the source of where these ideas come from in the work of the French philosopher Michel Foucault. We've been able to establish so far that architecture has a certain role and a function in establishing the regulatory mechanisms that afford the conditions for particular ways of living, whether that's at the domestic scale or at the institutional scale, say, of the hospital. The twist that we now introduce is to say that that functionality of architecture is also the potential and the capacity for power. And that power can go in different ways. It can be the power to care, the power to protect through architectural situations by enclosing and providing services and conditions for health and life for people. But it can also mean the power to control, perhaps in a negative way, to limit the freedom of somebody, to deny somebody the means of life, to exclude people. So by introducing the idea of power, we also open ourselves to thinking about how architecture exists within a potentially unequal field for the regulation of collective life. And we're going to continue that thinking by focusing on LA. But briefly first, we're going to look at the work of Foucault himself, because Foucault came up with this term. And it's, Foucault's writings are extensive and complicated. We're just going to select a very small kind of part. And we're going to focus in on an area where Foucault is interested in the medicalization of the population. So we're working with Foucault in a similar territory, in the idea of medical systems, hospitals, and those kinds of environments. And within those kinds of spaces, Foucault is interested in highlighting these regulatory mechanisms. And this is a concept I've tried to use in the lecture so far, as different ways that help to establish an equilibrium of some kind. And this is certainly what architectural regulatory mechanisms do, whether that's walls or glazing, ventilation, plumbing, electrical systems. They all attempt to establish an equilibrium, and this makes them regulatory mechanisms, or they can be called security mechanisms. But they're all there to deal with the random element that characterizes planetary existence at a population scale. So we're thinking here beyond the scale really of the domestic and the home, and much more at planet-scaled systems and the way that they are ruled and governed. Well, all of those technologies including architectural, but they're also medical regulatory mechanisms, legal regulatory mechanisms. They constitute altogether a technology of biopower. And this, I think, is a powerful concept and a powerful phrase to think of architecture as one of a number of interlinking technologies of biopower which regulate and control our collective life on planet Earth. So that's the source, that's the origin of the notion of biopower. Let's now look at a specific and local example of one of these regulatory mechanisms at an urban scale in LA, and that is shade. The regulation of light in the urban environment and its particular relationship to life, medicalized life, the existence, the comfortability of life. And to do that, we're going to look at a brilliant film that's just been released by the SCI-Arc channel. It's about 14 minutes long, and it features the work of journalist Sam Block, who has worked in LA specifically on the problem of shade. And I hope that you'll see by watching this video, you'll be able to connect it with our framing ideas of architecture as an environmental regulatory mechanism, and see very explicitly how the provision of an urban architectural mechanism such as shade is absolutely bound up with power over people's bodies, power over people's lives. So let's watch the film, enjoy it, and I will just come back at the very end for a brief moment to wrap up.
I hadn't really seen people talking about shade as a critical element of life in a city, and naturally as a provision or as a way of describing and examining the inequality of a contemporary American city. My name is Sam Block. I'm a journalist. I live in New York City, and I became involved with Places Journal when I was a graduate student at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. I submitted a proposal for a long-form article or essay about shade inequality in Los Angeles, and that became the 2019 Places Journal article, Shade. I live in New York now, but I used to live in Los Angeles, and specifically in a very shady, wealthy enclave called Mount Washington. And when I used to come down from Mount Washington to go to work in the morning, I would go down Cypress Boulevard, and I would hang right on Ave 26 to get down to Figueroa. And right at the intersection of Ave 26 and Figueroa is an unassuming storefront belonging to Tony's Barbershop. When I used to drive past on my way to work, I would notice the people in Los Angeles waiting for the bus. And they weren't waiting under a shelter, they weren't waiting in the comfort of shade, they were waiting and standing behind a telephone pole. Because on this street, which was being blasted with the sun's rays as it came up in the morning, there was nowhere to hide from the sun. And that doesn't sound like much, but imagine waiting there for 10, 15, 20 minutes in the morning, not knowing when your bus is going to show up. As I've experienced a few times, that can be stressful, it can be nerve-wracking, it can be anxious, and more to the point, the thermal load of the sun, all that heat and energy that's dropping onto your body is actually heating you up. making you sweat. It would follow then that if you're waiting for the bus in the morning, you'd want to hide from that sun. But there was nowhere to hide from that sun in front of Tony's barbershop. That is until around the year 2013. That's when I started to notice that someone decided to do something about it. Now, when I talked to Tony, the owner of the barbershop, he swore to me that he wasn't the guy who built the Risquache Oasis, the makeshift kind of DIY low-class bus shelter in front of his barbershop. But suffice it to say, he knew a lot about it, and he cared very much about the welfare of the women and children, he said, that needed somewhere to wait for the bus in the morning. Underneath that canopy, someone dropped a couple milk crates and put a piece of wood over there to make a little bus bench. So here you have it, a sheltered bus stop for the hundreds of people who took the bus every morning. Part of the reason why someone had to build a bus shelter in front of Tony's barbershop is because there just isn't a lot of shade on streets like these in LA. Figueroa is in many ways an archetypal Los Angeles street. I think somewhere around 7 lanes of traffic for cars and not very much space for pedestrians. Now that's arguably because Los Angeles, maybe perhaps more than any other American city, has really turned itself over to the automobile. So when you look at the real estate of a street in Los Angeles, almost all of it is given over to cars and to traffic and to parking. That leaves very little space on the sidewalk for pedestrians. You might wonder why there's not more shade trees on a street like that, given that there are people who need to stand and wait there in the sun. Well, that's because there's lots of other competing infrastructure on that street, namely the overhead power lines. Fact is, when there are utilities poles with sagging power lines, that creates an obstruction. Arborists are not allowed to plant big leafy shade trees under these because they might conflict and they might cause fires. It's a very reasonable concern, but suffice it to say, when these overhead power lines were installed, not a lot of thought was being given to what it must have been like to be a walker, to be a pedestrian on the streets in LA. And again, that's because, by and large, the overriding cultural assumption in Los Angeles in the mid-20th century wasn't that people would be waiting for the bus or that people would be walking, they would be in cars. In order to ensure that more neighborhoods have shade in Los Angeles, I think we really need to start thinking about shade as a kind of infrastructure, which is something that Christopher Hawthorne, the city's chief design officer, has said. Now that might sound odd, thinking about shade as an infrastructure, but if we think about shade as a kind of utility or a provision that advances a goal, in this case thermal comfort and thermal equality, let's say, a way to reduce the disparities between the hot, formerly redline neighborhoods that are filled with industrial infrastructure and don't have any room for shade trees, that have poorly insulated and poorly built homes, versus the wealthier enclaves, which climactically and geographically have no reason to be leafier and shadier and cooler, but were built in such a way that prized and made room for what was at the time an amenity, but what we now know to be a life-saving and crucial public health infrastructure. So if we were to think about shade as a kind of infrastructure, that would require us to do a few things in Los Angeles. Maybe when we were laying out streets, we wouldn't put all the water mains and the overhead power lines and the spaces for cars. Maybe all of these sort of other needs wouldn't take right of way. Maybe we would start to think about, well, how do we ensure that there's a shade tree here? Or better yet, how, when we are reconstructing or re-engineering or just building this new sidewalk, do we make sure that we have enough space in here for both the ADA clearance of a wheelchair and also a bus shelter and also a tree, and really center the pedestrian and people first before these other utilities.
My name is Helene Schbach. I'm currently the president of the Glassell Park Improvement Association here in Glassell Park. What people need to really use, appreciate, enjoy the public transportation system is to set up a system that is not only equitable across the city, but provides some of the basic human needs: shelter, safety, lighting, access with visibility. This should just be common. This should be part of the public transit infrastructure. We have approximately 8,000 bus stops in the city, and I think barely a third of them have any type of comfortable shelter area. And I think the city of Los Angeles needs to step up, really do a lot better on this, make this a priority, since it benefits everything that the city says it would like to achieve. What creates change is it takes just an enormous amount of effort from individuals bringing attention to the matter, to the city, and forcing the change.
My name is James Rojas, and I'm a city planner, born and raised in East Los Angeles. I've been looking at the Latino built environment for the past 30 years. And for a lot of Latinos, building relationships with the landscape and others is a part of their identity. My work is to really highlight and understand how they built relationships within the built environment. Really looking at front yards and shade is really a critical part of the landscape. The word Wasquacha means basically DIY, do it yourself. And for Wasquacha is very genuine. So these landscapes really reflect people's needs through a memory and an aspiration. And it also creates these landscapes of cultural production. Culture is produced here in this front yard. It's a way to really think about, Wasquacha as an aesthetic and aspiration and memory, but they're based on people's needs and their own particular interests and values. But I think one of the things that's important about shade is about a relationship. When you're under shade with your friends in a shelter, relationship, with people, if they start thinking about, their transportation, have the relationship to kind of build that kind of infrastructure to support better mobility, that makes us feel that it's part of our lives. So when I worked at Metro, I was trying to implement some, bus shelter programs because a lot of our bus stops didn't have shelters. But again, it's one of these kind of typical spider webs where, the city owns the land, Metro owns the pole. So it's all negotiation that has to happen. And since there wasn't a lot of push for it, 10 years ago or 15 years ago in LA, you could not even have a shade conversation. The kind of shade that we need in LA, we need different types of shade, from dark shade to twinkly shade, but we need it all. And I think it's important to see the different cultural values of shade.
My name is John Yee, and I am the Executive Director for Los Angeles Walks. We are LA's pedestrian advocacy nonprofit. Some of the ways that we make sure we have a walkable Los Angeles and we fight for pedestrian access is we're community organizers. Basic life-saving pedestrian infrastructure is incredibly difficult to come by here in Los Angeles for a myriad of reasons, but one of the larger reasons is that we have an incredibly difficult city system one has to navigate. And so what we do to make sure we have more pedestrian access and infrastructure is we partner with communities, primarily immigrant monolingual communities, and we work with them to navigate city systems for infrastructure such as flat sidewalks, crosswalks, speed humps, road diets, bike lanes, and things like that. Shade is an important part of infrastructure because it provides comfort when you're walking down the street. There's so many factors that lead us to taking our sidewalks and walking. And a big part of the discouragement and all that, especially in Los Angeles, is just the heat and the sun that's relentless on you. And so for a city as large as LA, for a city with as much sun as LA, it's important that when we're walking to our streets, when we're waiting at our bus stop, there's shade protecting us. And it's not just about the comfortability, it's also about health. There's been studies done that show that communities with a lack of shade are degrees-wise is hotter. And so that impacts everything from lung health to particle pollution to just general well-being and comfortability of using your streets. And so that's why shade plays an important part, not just with comfort and ease, but just health and also community well-being as well. If you have a community that's accessible where people can walk with comfort, that's a stronger community. And so it goes also back to the fundamental question of how do we see our communities and how do we see those who walk through our communities.
My article for Places Journal really advanced a very specific argument, and one that's probably become pretty familiar to a lot of viewers and readers, which is that in the era of global warming, we really need to stop thinking about shade as a kind of an amenity or a comfort. And we need to start thinking about it as an index of inequality, one that corresponds to racial and economic lines, and as many researchers have since pointed out, actual historic red line maps. So the presence of shade correlates and corresponds to Black and minority neighborhoods that were systemically excluded from receiving the kind of capital and the kinds of investments that lead to trees that create cooler neighborhoods today. So we can think about shade as an index of inequality. We can think about it as a way to talk about public health insofar as the hotter shade bereft neighborhoods are going to be those where you have vulnerable people who, again, because shade confers a kind of wealth and property value, are going to be poorer, and they're going to be less likely to afford to turn on their air conditioning bills than those who live in these leafier, shadier neighborhoods. It's not just an index of inequality, it's not just a way to measure and talk about public health, particularly as we have more killer heat waves that are really striking hard at these neighborhoods where you don't have the kind of natural amenities and infrastructure to stay cool, to stay resilient, as climate planners would say, in the face of global warming. It's also a mandate for urban design. And my book is going to explore that third piece a little bit more. How has it been that for hundreds, if not thousands of years, we have found ways to design with shade? And I'm going to be talking about things like in Italy, the presence of colonnaded arcades in Bologna, but also in other cities and regions that have been more vulnerable and more at the whims and vicissitudes of the elements, like in Northern Africa or the Mediterranean or Australia or Southeast Asia. How has it been that since the beginning of these civilizations, the beginning of these cities, that people have been able to live, frankly, without air conditioning? And oftentimes the case is that they were able to survive through the provision of shade. That's not just trees, that's also covered streets, that's also narrower streets where settlements are built denser and closer together, which at the time was a way to sort of block out the sun and just keep the thermal masses cooler and keep the sun off those materials. Also, of course, a function of sort of medieval settlements where you have these walls and real estate is limited. But both of those things point to a kind of tradition or heritage or a way of building that maybe we could bring back today and not just deal with climate and comfort and the dignity of waiting on the street, but maybe even solve some housing shortages. I mean, housing and density is good for pedestrians. Part of what interests me about shade and part of why I was drawn to talk about shade and report on shade and do this reporting for Places Journal is because I knew that this was an issue that at the time I didn't really see a lot of people talking about living in Los Angeles. Just seeing where shade was and knowing that those were always, the greener neighborhoods were always the richer ones. The poorer neighborhoods, the most sun-baked ones, were always those that had the least amount of shade and the most poor people, and the people who needed bus shelters and trees the most. I knew that there was disparity and I knew there was this inequality, but I didn't really have the space or the time to do this kind of deep reporting. And that's something that I was able to do with Places Journal on this Writing the City grant. I had well over a year to conduct my research and to do my interviews. It was the most expansive and ambitious reporting I've ever done. And frankly, Places Journal was the place to do it, and Places Journal gave me the space and the resources to pursue it.
All right. So that brings us up to the scale of the city and its infrastructure. We began with the house, we went through the institution to the city, and it puts us at the footstep of the planet. So that's where we're going to pick up when we meet together to see if some of these issues that we've looked at can play out on the largest of scales, and also if we can relate them to our own personal experience of the last few months. So I look forward to seeing you for real and continuing these discussions. Be well in the meantime.